This notion of learning and experience, and as you put it, and something we have to be comfortable with, failure, you introduce a notion of pivot and persevere, and the importance of an entrepreneur or a team or a company knowing when to pivot and when to persevere. Can you describe what a pivot is and what persevering means? And then we'll talk a little bit about when do you know which one to pursue.
I think this is the most difficult question that entrepreneurs ever face. And I grimace whenever I think about it, because I think about the moments when I've been faced with this challenge of trying to make that decision, and it's just painful. And the goal of the Lean Startup methodology is not to actually make it painless. I don't think it ever will be painless. I think what we can do is make it a little bit more pleasant, make us a little bit more rational in that moment, give us a little bit better facts. And so one thing let's talk about what a pivot is. That's the first thing. A very common misconception. Pivot's like very overused bit of jargon and buzzword these days. A pivot is a change in strategy without a change in vision. So it's not giving up on the vision. If I'm in my car and I want to get to a certain destination and I encounter a roadblock, my GPS will help me route around and find a new path to get there. But my GPS won't tell me where to go. And I'd be crazy if I run into traffic and say, you know what, forget it. I'm going home. I don't want to get to I'm going to a different destination. Say, no. Encountering difficulty, that's par for the course. But the whole role of strategy in a startup is to help us find a new, better way around. So a pivot is a strategic hypothesis about how we could actualize our vision. It's not a change in the product. We change the product all the time. Make it better, try to make it easier to use, better performance. Those are just optimizations. And changing the vision is really just giving up. The challenge is, as entrepreneurs, sometimes we can't tell the difference between vision, strategy, and product. We view it all as one big package because when we were in the shower that one day when we had our idea, it came to us all in a flash. And actually, the reason it's so painful to pivot is it requires giving up some elements of what we thought we were going to be doing. And the reason we're giving them up is we realize, oh no, the distribution channel, that's not the thing I care the most about. It's actually serving customers and making their lives better. So if I can find a different path to get the product to them, I can let that go. Or sometimes we'll say, I thought this product would be for teenagers, but it's actually for adults. Those are the customers that actually want it. Am I willing to give up this customer segment because I actually learned I can serve this customer segment better? Those are the really difficult decisions. Most companies, when they're going to pivot, when they're going to have a meeting to decide whether it's time to pivot, it's painful because it's the 11th hour. It's the last minute. We're down to our last dollar. The roof is on fire. We've put it off as long as possible, and reality is, finally breaking through the boundaries. That is not a good environment for making calm and rational decisions. So part of the lesson of Lean Startup is we know we're going to have to pivot. Every successful startup had to pivot along the way. It's just a fact of life. So let's just schedule the meeting in advance. Let's just make it a regular part of our business discipline to say, hey, today it's time for the meeting to decide, are we on the right track? Do we believe in our strategy? Should we keep going? Should we persevere? Or should we pivot? And the great thing about scheduling the meeting, doing it, every 6 weeks, every 8 weeks, is that, first of all, it's a lot more pleasant. It doesn't give anyone, it doesn't inspire a lack of confidence because you admitting that you don't know, it's just a routine thing that we do. And second, we can work backwards from the date of the meeting to say, if 6 weeks from now I'm going to be asked to evaluate, is my strategy working? What evidence would I want to have 6 weeks from now that would give me confidence that I'm on the right track? And it lets us work backwards from what do we need to learn to what do I need to do today? And every team I've been through that exercise with discovers that right now as we speak, they are busy doing some things that actually don't contribute to their learning at all, and therefore won't help them figure out whether it's time to pivot, and are therefore a waste of time.
Interesting. In the book, you talk about several examples of the types of pivots. When you discover that a feature actually becomes the product, what other examples can you give of what represents a pivot if you're a lean startup team or a lean startup company?
Yeah, there's a whole catalog of different kinds of pivots. Yeah. And people who study business strategy, anyone who got an MBA, this is going to sound very familiar. That's what strategy is all about, is identifying what our options are so that we can figure out what's the best thing to test. The most common pivots are customer segment or customer pain pivots. Customer segment pivot says, we've found a problem that customers have. It's just not the customers we thought. It's a different set. So that example I gave of teenagers versus adults, I actually lived through a product like that. It was quite hard.
Yes.
Customer pain pivot is, we want to serve this customer. We thought the number one problem they have in their life is, this thing we're making. Actually, since we met those customers, they don't care at all about the thing we're making, but they have this other problem that's huge, and we could really solve that problem instead. There's the zoom in and the zoom out pivot. Zoom in happens when what was previously just one little feature of our product, becomes the whole product. Classic example is something like PayPal, which began as this whole cybersecurity suite, but customers only ever actually used it to email each other money. And they said, you know what? What if we made the whole product about emailing each other money? That could be a pretty good business. Turned out okay. Yeah. And then a zoom out pivot is exactly the opposite. Sometimes you realize we've built this amazing product. It's actually just one little tiny feature in what needs to be a whole product that will require partners and OEMs and all kinds of delivery, consulting, installation. It could require to be very complicated, and then all the other elements of a business plan could be eligible for pivot. The sales channel, the pricing strategy, and what we call the engine of growth, the way it grows, whether it's viral or through paid advertising. Again, none of those are an answer. They're actually a question, a hypothesis about a new way to go forward.
Interesting. You also talk about the importance of time and speed. Mm-hmm. And I'd just love to have you describe a little more about the importance of speed when it comes to making the decisions around pivoting, and put it in terms that entrepreneurs understand, which is typically how long do you have before you run out of money?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you just describe that concept a little bit?
Mm-hmm. We always talk about runway for startups, and this is true for the VC-backed startup, the garage startup, the internal corporate startup. It's the same thing. The day you start your project and you've promised everybody these amazing results, the clock is ticking till you run out of the key resources that allow you to go forward. And so we usually measure runway in time. In your typical Silicon Valley startup, we think about what we call the burn rate, which is how much money are we setting on fire every month. Let's say we're spending $10,000 a month and we have $100,000 in the bank. That means we got 10 months left before we run out of runway. And different startups calculate different ways, but usually we think about how much time do we have to achieve liftoff. That's why we call it a runway. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that actually misses the point. The real way to think about runway for a startup is how many opportunities to pivot do we have left. And the great thing about that is you start to say, wait a minute, if I've got 3, 4, 5 opportunities to pivot, but let's say I find a way to work faster, smarter, run better experiments, and I can realize it's time to pivot a little bit sooner, well, that has a cascading effect that actually magically extends my runway without me having to have raised a single extra dollar. So that's the really deep reason why lean startups are more capital efficient. It's because we get to the moment of realizing it's time to pivot a little bit sooner.
That's interesting. And it completely changes the paradigm. And I loved how you describe in the book that lean does not mean cheap.
Absolutely not.
And what you just described is an example of how lean actually helps you extend the opportunities that you have. Mm-hmm. So that's around pivoting. What about the other big question, which is when to persevere versus not persevere? How do you know when you're out of runway?
The nice thing about entrepreneurs, the true entrepreneurs I know, is they never worry about this problem because they only ever stop due to an involuntary termination. The money runs out, the project is canceled, the building actually explodes. I mean, most entrepreneurs only fail at one speed, full speed right up against the wall. So I don't usually worry about the likelihood that they'll give up. I think the much bigger danger for entrepreneurs, honestly, is the thing we call the land of the living dead, where you've got a project and it's still alive. It has some customers, some revenue, it's not a complete failure, but it's not making any progress either. The growth rates are completely flat. It's not actually getting to its next milestone, but it's kind of not successful enough to be put out of its misery, but not successful enough to actually be successful, to actually get up to the next stage. And I meet entrepreneurs who can get stuck in that phase, sometimes for years, where they can't quite bring themselves to pivot, and they can't quite bring themselves to shut it down, and so they have this kind of misguided decision to persevere. All of the analytical rigor of Lean Startup is geared towards making sure that startups don't wind up in that situation by giving us hard evidence that what we're doing isn't working. Even if the gross numbers are kind of sort of okay, that's not good enough.
Very interesting, very helpful. So Eric, on this notion of pivot, when does an entrepreneur, or when should an entrepreneur know when to pivot?
It's still going to be a matter of judgment. We can never turn entrepreneurship into a formula, and nor would that even really be desirable because entrepreneurship is a really human experience. But I do think there are some heuristics that suggest it's time to pivot. If you think about the iterations that a startup goes through, making the product better, cycle after cycle after cycle. If we're using an analytical framework that tells us whether those experiments actually make a difference for customers, then we can ask ourselves, do we feel like our numbers are trending the way they need to trend? or are they kind of flat or not making that big a difference? So I meet with teams, I kid you not, that have a key metric that's got to be, say, 10%, customers signing up for a free trial. And right now it's 5%. And they're working cycle after cycle, and they go from 5% to 5.5% to 5.75% to 5.8% to 5.85%. It's your classic curve of diminishing returns. And yet they're still celebrating because everything's up and to the right. And we've all been trained, if things are up and to the right, everything must be working fine. And I think that getting that into what we call an innovation accounting dashboard, where we can see that point of diminishing returns, say, our experiments don't seem like they're really being as productive as they used to. I think that's the number one indication that it's time to pivot.
Very interesting. We talk about this at our company. We really want our employees, we want all of our people to be solving big, important problems. We say if you want a big business, solve a big problem. But human nature is to begin to incrementalize everything you have, to look for that next opportunity just to continue to optimize versus truly invent and solve a big, important problem well. And so what you just helped us see is our own blind spot. And that's probably a good opportunity for us to wrap. I want to thank you. I want to thank you for your inspiration. I want to thank you for your counsel. And I want to thank you for helping us with a methodology in a company that was founded by an entrepreneur who tries very hard to have 8,000 entrepreneurs every day looking for new ways to solve important problems so that our customers' lives will be better. It really has helped us be better, and we look forward to practicing and, quite frankly, working with you more in the future.
Hey, really appreciate that.
Thanks
Thank
a lot,
you so
my
much,
friend.
Yeah,
My pleasure.
thank you.